Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Let's talk about the recent moves by Russia and China, the duo that's got everyone asking, are we witnessing a new era of global relations? China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made headlines during his visit to Moscow by declaring that China and Russia are friends forever, never enemies. Now, that's a friendship bracelet that would make any middle schooler jealous. But let's unpack that statement, shall we? Friends forever sounds heartwarming, but in the world of international politics, it's not so much about friendship as it is about strategic interests aligning like planets in a solar system. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Russian President Vladimir Putin met with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi as part of Wang's three-day visit to Russia. The main theme of the meeting, at least the part that was made available to the media, was mutual backpatting.
We want to express our satisfaction with the way our relations are developing, including with the direct contacts between our foreign ministries.
Officially, the meeting focused on strengthening bilateral ties and preparing for Chinese President Xi Jinping's upcoming visit to Moscow in early May. Xi will be the main guest at Russia's May 9th celebrations marking the 80th anniversary of the victory in World War II.
Thanks to the care and promotion of the two heads of state, China-Russia political mutual trust has continued to deepen.
During his visit, the Chinese foreign minister also met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Beijing is the Kremlin's most important trading partner, especially now that Russia's economy is being hammered by sanctions. For Moscow, every opportunity to expand that cooperation is of the utmost importance.
And now we're zoning in on the East-splaining portion of our show. In 2024, China-Russia trade reached a record high, amounting to almost $250 billion. Despite sanctions, trade between the two countries has been steadily growing. But what exactly did they exchange, and in what quantities? Let's take a look.
According to data released by Chinese customs, Beijing's trade with Moscow reached a record high in 2024, totaling 1.74 trillion yuan, or almost $250 billion. The value of trade between the two allies grew by almost 3% compared to 2023, though the pace slowed significantly from previous more than 30% increase. Though percentages on this chart based on data by the Observatory of Economic Complexity are for 2023, the trend is still the same. China's top exports to Russia include cars and various vehicles, alongside telephones and broadcasting equipment, with computers and electronics also seeing significant growth. On the other side, Russia's exports to China are heavily dominated by energy resources, with crude petroleum leading, followed by petroleum gas and coal briquettes. This shows that China assumes the role of a manufacturing hub supplying consumer and tech goods, while Russia bolsters its position as a critical energy provider, fueling China's industrial demands. For comparison, trade between China and the United States grew by 3.7% in 2024, reaching almost $690 billion, though US President Donald Trump's tariffs may affect that.
And now it's time to take a closer look at the issue at hand. So, let's begin. Wang Yi's visit wasn't just about exchanging pleasantries. It coincided with talks of a ceasefire in Ukraine and a notable shift in US foreign policy under President Donald Trump. The Kremlin has been vocal about working on ideas for a possible peace settlement in Ukraine and building bilateral ties with the US. This comes, of course, after a period of frosty relations that made the Cold War look like a summer vacation. But now, with Trump back in the Oval Office, there is a renewed push to thaw those relations. It's almost as if the scriptwriters for The World decided to add a plot twist no one saw coming. Enter Kirill Dmitriev, Russia's investment envoy and head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund. Now, Dmitriev is expected to visit Washington for talks with members of the Trump administration. This is significant because he's the most senior Russian official to visit since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Dmitriev's visit could involve discussions on a range of initiatives for US-Russia cooperation, potentially carrying a message from Putin to Trump. Now, if that message includes, let's be besties and forget about that whole Ukraine thing, we might need to pump the brakes. But if it involves serious talks about ending the conflict and addressing global challenges, then maybe, just maybe, we could be onto something. Meanwhile, China's Wang Yi is applauding these developments, stating that the steps towards normalizing US-Russia relations are encouraging. Let's not forget, China has its own interests at play, and a stable Washington-Moscow relationship could mean more room for China to maneuver on the global stage. However, not everyone is singing Kumbaya just yet. Ukraine and its European allies are understandably wary of any deals made without their direct involvement. It's like planning a surprise party for someone and then forgetting to invite them. The fear is that any agreement reached without Ukraine's input could undermine its sovereignty and security. President Trump, in his characteristic style, has expressed a desire to end the 3-year war in Ukraine while contemplating sanctions against buyers of Russian crude. It is a carrot-and-stick approach that leaves everyone guessing which one they'll get. Will it be the sweet taste of peace or the bitter pill of economic penalties? So, where does this leave us? Are we on the brink of a new era of diplomacy, or is this just another round of political posturing? The truth is, it's too early to tell. But while the headlines may paint a picture of blossoming friendships and diplomatic breakthroughs, it is essential to read between the lines. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Velina Chakarova, founder of the FACE Geopolitical consultancy. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello and thank you for the invitation.
So, you often refer to the alliance between Russia and China as the Dragon Bear. Judging by the appearance of Mr. Wang Yi in Moscow recently, where does the Dragon Bear stand today?
Just for clarification, what I coined as the Dragon Bear means practically a modus operandi of strategic coordination in all systemically relevant domains between China and Russia. It has been a development that started back in 2014-2015. Right now, what we witnessed with the most recent political meetings between the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Russian President Vladimir Putin, respectively the Foreign Minister Lavrov, is practically a manifestation of the deepening relationship between these two powers. And the meeting is to be seen as a part of broader series of bilateral and multilateral engagements that is focused on expanding trade and economic ties, but also military and defense cooperation, energy integration, as well as coordination of global and regional governance reforms.
So this doesn't really, on the surface, sound like something that could be easily broken, right? The Trump administration has been toying with the idea of the reverse Nixon maneuver, but judging by what was said during that meeting between Mr. Wang Yi and Mr. Putin, seems like this idea could be over before it even began. Do you think that this was actually a feasible option from the very start?
Well, we have to regard the current American efforts to, let's say, break the Dragon Bear, or better said, to lure Russia away from the Dragon Bear, as efforts that will probably only succeed partially in, let's say, in neutralizing the Russian positions on some key issues. I don't think that anybody in this Trump administration is realistic about the potential of a reverse Nixon-Kissinger approach to Russia. Practically what was applied to China in the 70s through the entanglement of China into all US-led networks and relevant systems to lure China away from the Soviet Union, and which later also resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So to wrap it up for you, I think that this relaunch of the strategic dialogue between US and Russia aims to create a platform, or better said, several different platforms for engagement between Washington and Moscow, which should result in some sort of neutralization of this Russian position. And here I also don't have an answer for you whether the Trump administration will be successful, but there will keep on trying. What do I mean by platforms? Of course, is to be seen as first and foremost the dimension of the Russian war against Ukraine. Second, the Russian support and the Russian-Iranian actually cooperation and coordination in the Middle East and beyond. And the third important dimension is, of course, the Russian-North Korean one. That is the defense pact between these two countries and the mutual support and by extension, of course, the relationship with China.
Now, there is also the big question how Europe should respond to these efforts. And quite recently, you wrote on social media that Trump wants to normalize relations with Russia to break the dragon bear and focus on China. Europe should leverage this shift to secure US support for Ukraine while aligning with Washington and countering China as a systemic rival. My question is Europe ready to treat China as a systemic rival here?
No, it is not. But this has to do with the fact that there is no strategic thinking in Brussels or in any of the European capitals right now. Let's be honest about it. The so-called de-risking approach that the European Union launched towards China, that is an approach that would engage China on some topics and would confront China on other topics, is, in my view, destined to fail, similarly to the famous Wandel durch Handel approach towards Russia. That was the approach that was more or less relevant for more than 20 years, if you remember, considering modernization and economic ties and technological transfer to Russia in order to pacify it and to prevent a scenario in which Russia would become aggressive towards its neighbors. And we saw what happened. So similarly, this de-risking approach towards China is destined to fail. Why? Because first and foremost, now we are actually hearing a lot of European voices making the case that we should expand the ties with China as a response to the aggressive trade policies from Washington, right? And if they decide to do that, they will actually increase the vulnerabilities and the dependencies on China in a precarious moment for Europe, a moment of decisive strategic vision where you actually have to make tough choices and to pick carefully your partners and allies. So what do I mean by that? Just to finish my line of thinking is that Europe has to pick sides. It's a Cold War II between America on the one side and the dragon bear on the other side. There is no more space for oscillation and trying to avoid tough choices.
So you mentioned that this scenario could actually be similar to the Cold War and that Europe pretty much has this sort of simple choice of two options there, right? Where do you think Russia is going to be there? Because you mentioned that, this is going to be dragon bear versus the US and its allies. So you're not thinking that Russia could be left somewhat on the outside, that if there is confrontation between the US and China, do you think Russia will definitely get involved in that?
Not only do I think that, but I've been arguing that Russia has sided with China prior to taking the decision on going all in on Ukraine. Russia would have never started a full-scale war on Ukraine if it had not relied on the comprehensive long-term support coming from China. So Russia has sided with China in this, new bifurcation of the global world, of the global system. And right now, the strategic patience of Russia, that is practically based on the heaviest loss ever, as we've been witnessing over the last 3 years, is paying off because Russia has gained the pole position in the strategic rivalry between United States and China. Neither the United States nor China are in the position of ignoring Russia because Russia in itself can actually change the global power equation. So that means that from China's perspective, this normalization of the relationship between United States and Russia that might result, let's say, in a reverse Nixon-Kissinger approach is the worst case scenario. But from American perspective, the worst case scenario is already happening, and that is the dragon bear modus operandi of strategic coordination. That is why I'm trying to make the case that there is no space for Europe as a geoeconomic power on par with China and America to oscillate and to pursue this equidistance approach between these two great powers. Unless Europe decides to become a third geopolitical actor, but then again, it will need a lot of partners from the global south. And that would mean a lot of more agency and leadership that I'm not seeing at the moment.
And also, we're talking about this at a moment when sanctions are coming into effect. Of course, these will be followed by negotiations. But at first glance, it doesn't really look great for the European Union. So do you think that the European Union will be able to navigate basically all these challenges that it faces, including tariffs imposed by Trump? And should its direction lead it towards greater alliance with the US, even despite all these economic disputes, which are either already there or which could still be around the corner?
Now, you need to understand that we together, I mean, the member states, the institutions, and the citizens of the European Union have moved from the scenario in which we were dependent on Russian fossil fuels, we were dependent on markets in China and production from China, and we were dependent on security umbrella provided by the US. So we moved from this scenario now towards a scenario in which we are still very much dependent on the American security umbrella, but we are increasingly dependent on the American fossil fuels. And obviously, if you were paying attention at the number of companies leaving the European Union and relocating in America because of skyrocketing energy costs, we are increasingly dependent on access to markets and practically own America also for this specific dimension. So I just don't see how these dependencies will be reduced on behalf of the European Union, given the ambitious agenda, including rearmament by 2030, including reindustrialization, or what was described as competitiveness agenda, and then, of course, the most ambitious Green Deal in the world. So something's got to give. And in this context, which is a highly volatile geopolitical context, it is not strategically smart to antagonize your most important strategic partner. Now we will be hearing a lot of voices making the case of strategic autonomy in Europe, but this should have been the case 20 years or 15 years ago. Do we have to rearm? Yes, absolutely. Do we have to reindustrialize? Absolutely. We will continue with the decarbonization, most likely, but with a prolonged agenda. And that all will necessitate really stable and steady relationship with the US.
Evelina Chakarova was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you very much for your invitation.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. For the first time since Russia's full-scale invasion, Poland has extradited a Russian agent accused of spreading pro-Kremlin propaganda. The suspect is now being held in a Kiev pretrial detention center and faces up to 12 years behind bars.
According to Ukrainian authorities, Kirill Molchanov worked for both Russia's Federal Security Services and its Foreign Intelligence Agency. His activities aimed to destabilize Ukraine and its allies by organizing pro-Kremlin demonstrations in the EU and using online platforms to promote Russian narratives. In 2023, Molchanov, a frequent guest on Russian state TV, appeared 35 times on Vladimir Solovyov's talk show, where he allegedly justifies Russia's war against Ukraine and spread disinformation. He was reportedly linked to Viktor Medvedchuk, a pro-Russian Ukrainian politician with close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Molchanov now faces charges under Ukraine's criminal code for legitimizing Russian aggression and engaging in collaborationist activities, with a potential prison sentence of up to 12 years.
Russia's State Duma has approved the first reading of a legislative package aimed at tightening control over dissent and expanding state repression. The proposed laws broaden the definition of foreign agent, allow trials in absentia for anti-war offenses, and introduce harsher penalties for criticizing the military.
Russia is on a path to once again tighten its grip on anyone who dares to speak out against the Kremlin's actions. One bill of the proposed legislative package expands the criteria for labeling individuals as foreign agents, targeting those assisting foreign organizations deemed contrary to Russian interests. Another measure permits trials in absentia for Russians abroad, including those accused of spreading fakes about the military or discrediting the army. The third bill enforces stricter penalties for anti-war activities, with sentences up to 7 years for aiding international organizations. If enacted, these laws will further entrench the Kremlin's crackdown on dissent, restricting free speech and targeting Russians both inside and outside the country.
A new poll by the independent Levada Center reveals deep divisions within Russian society over the prospect of a ceasefire. Let's examine the issue in greater detail.
As it turns out, around 50% of Russians support a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine. The Levada Center found that 26% of respondents strongly support a truce, while 24% somewhat support it. Opposition remains high at 41%, with many believing a ceasefire would allow Ukraine to rearm. Support is strongest among women, young people, and those skeptical of President Vladimir Putin or state media, while older Russians and daily television viewers are more likely to oppose it. The poll follows Ukraine's acceptance of a US proposed 30-day ceasefire in March, which Russia rejected, demanding conditions that would weaken Kiev's defenses. Instead, the two sides, along with the US, agreed to a limited truce covering energy infrastructure and the Black Sea, though it has yet to take effect due to ongoing violations and Russian demands for sanctions relief.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.